I think the wage gap, to explain it really is, well, the wage gap has barely budged over 20 years.
Exude Human Capital hosts Hold On, Let Me Close My Door, bringing real HR stories from real professionals with real solutions to you. Join us as we navigate the ever-changing workplace with Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner, Exude Human Capital, and special guests. Welcome, everyone, to episode 2 of Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. Today, I'm really excited to talk about something that has come up frequently, at least every week, in some cases almost every day, over the past several years in our practice here at Exude Human Capital. And that is pay disclosure, pay transparency. How transparent do we really need to be, and why? And I'm so honored today to have with me a special guest, Joe Bennett. Joe, welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
So great to see you. And Joe, for those of you listening, is a partner in the employment and labor practice with Culhane Meadows. It's a national full-service law firm. And Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's majority woman-owned business.
That's exactly right. The largest majority women-owned business law firm in the country.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. And, you know, Joe, I don't remember how long ago it was that I first met you, but I remember that the first time I met you, we were co-presenting on some changes to the EEOC reporting rules. And I remember how you took such a complex situation and made it entertaining and interesting for our audience. So I'm really thrilled to have you back today to share a bit with our listeners about what's happening in the pay disclosure, pay transparency space, and perhaps share some insights and tips on what employers should be doing. But first, can you talk a little bit about your firm and your experience in this space?
Well, yes, I have practiced labor employment law for a little more than 25 years now. And my practices consist of both what I would call consulting and telephone advice, and now Zoom advice, and a litigation practice. I work with employers of all sizes, but, you know, a lot of the smaller, just sort of typical HR day-to-day things, employee leave, Family Medical Leave Act issues. Litigation is typically on all of the alphabet soup of all of the anti-discrimination laws. And one area where I work with employers is in affirmative action. I work with federal contractors on affirmative action compliance issues, and compensation over the years has been a part of that, and in more recent years become a very big part of compliance. And you know, about 20%, maybe 25% of the U.S. workforce works for federal contractors. So that's not a small slice of the U.S. labor force. So that's really where I do a lot more with comp, and work with some clients on pay equity issues.
That's great. And certainly, you know, from the HR perspective, I think it's fair to say we've seen more changes in the compensation front in the last few years than we saw in the previous 2 decades. Fair to say?
I think that is fair to say. And the activity really has been a lot at the state level, mostly at the state level, and at some local levels as well.
Yeah. And so, you know, just to set a little context as we get into this conversation, that in addition to this change we've seen in compensation, the labor market has shifted, and I know you've seen this with your clients. We certainly have seen it. Employers were forced to increase salaries at a rapid pace over the last couple of years in order to remain competitive in the race for talent. And that was kind of accelerating what we had been seeing as a focus on pay equity that was there. To your point, we were seeing some state laws, state rules happening to try to close those wage gaps for women and minorities. We've also on the employee front seen a big increase in demand for more pay transparency. And I put that in quotes because obviously that means different things to different people. But I think it's fair or important for our listeners to hear a couple of stats as to how relevant this is to today's job seekers. So a recent study showed that 53% of all job seekers won't apply to jobs that don't disclose a pay range on the job posting. And for the Gen Z population, that jumps to 65%. Another interesting fun fact is that 41% of jobs or workers believe that disclosing their salaries would lead to more pay equality. But with that Gen Z group, that new group that's in our workplaces now, that jumps to 81%. So 81% of Gen Z workers believe disclosing their salaries would lead to more pay equality. And on the employer side of that, we see, and Joe, I don't know if you see this, but I see employers having some mixed reactions to just how transparent do we really need to be and how transparent can we be or should we be? So let's start with just kind of understanding what's the purpose of pay disclosure laws and what do the rules require?
Okay, well, let's talk about that. The laws, I think, are an effort to close the wage gap between mostly women and men. That's what we hear a lot about, the gender wage gap. And I think the wage gap, to explain it really is, well, the wage gap has barely budged over 20 years. But what we're talking about is the difference for every dollar that a man earns, a woman earns 83 cents, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics last survey, and this is for 2021. That difference between men and women is greater for women of color. I think African-American women are typically earning 64 cents on the dollar, and women who are Hispanic at 54%. Now, that is not a comparison of like jobs. It's simply a statement of when we look at all of the groups in the workforce, women just make less than men. But what some of the research has shown, again, from the Department of Labor, is that even when you start drilling down on industry, the wage gap still exists.
Which is shocking that over all this time, there's been so little change in the gap.
Well, there hasn't been much change in federal law. And at least when you look at that, is discrimination is a very challenging area and a very challenging area to prove discrimination because there are so many factors that can go into making pay decisions. But I think, again, the purpose of the laws really are, let's start putting some information out there. And the rules are really vary by state. At this point, in 3 days, New York will become, I believe, the 9th state to have some pay transparency laws on the books. Several states, 3 states, California, Washington State, New York State, are going to require that salary ranges be disclosed in job postings. So this could be, the old days we would think of a newspaper posting, but now it's your website, your corporate website. You post a job on LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, wherever you post your positions. If you are advertising or inviting applicants, at least in those jurisdictions, you need to put a salary range in the posting. Some of the laws are requiring employers to disclose the salary at a certain point in the application process, either by responding specifically to a request by the applicant or an affirmative duty to disclose at some point in the application process. And then there are some state laws that require disclosure to current employees.
Oh, interesting.
So for example, the New York state law that goes into effect September 17th, anytime you put a job posting up, even internal, there's a requirement that you post the salary range. So internal candidates and people will start to talk, and we can talk a little bit about, the right to employees to discuss with each other their pay. And again, this is oddly enough something that's often overlooked by many employers. So the National Labor Relations Act, which is the federal statute governing collective bargaining and union organizing, there's a provision that applies to all employers, union and non-union. And so the agency has always taken the position that employees who are covered by the act, and that's all non-managerial employees, and including professional employees, certainly have a right to talk about compensation in the workplace. You can't, as an employer, retaliate against them. Federal contractors are required to have pay transparency policies such that employees are free to talk about compensation in the workplace. And again, no retaliation for an employee engaging in that right.
So that's interesting. So for the federal contractors, they're actually required to have a pay transparency policy.
Right. That permits employees to talk about pay. It's not a requirement that they post salaries when we're talking about these developments in state law. That's a slightly different process, right?
So you just described, you mentioned that the different states have different requirements. We know since the pandemic, many employers kind of increased their geographical boundaries in terms of where they were hiring people. So they may have employees in multiple states. How can they, or what's the best approach for them to ensure that they're being compliant with these rules if they operate in multiple states with multiple sets of rules?
Well, you can, there's a lot of online resources, I think, for HR departments and the folks at companies who have responsibility for comp. So they certainly could read up and comply with each one, but it does become difficult as we move to a either hybrid or sometimes fully remote workforce. We've all learned that during the pandemic. And so I think of the sort of the certain way to make sure you're on top is to find the state that has the most restrictive requirements, the most requirements on an employer, and follow that particular procedure. And it should put someone in compliance with all of the posting requirements in other states. But remember, some of these other states will have an affirmative duty to disclose if you don't put it in the job posting. So there's all of these wrinkles. But as a general rule, I think the Washington State posting policy is the strictest. Now, and again, you have to look at the threshold of employees and the companies it applies to. So in Washington State, you have to have 15 or more employees and only one or more Washington-based employees. So that's it. One employee in Washington State, you have to comply. And of course, the issue, I think, Allison, is these days when a company posts for a position that could be remote anywhere, right? And they have to assume that somebody from Washington State is going to apply. I mean, you basically have to put it out there that I'm ready to hire anybody from any state if I'm looking for somebody who's working fully remote. And I think there's some articles I've seen earlier this year, published reports about, at least all positions, maybe half the positions in California, which is another state that requires posting, and in Colorado, or maybe half the jobs already. And the laws in California took effect at the start of this year, January of 2023. So again, lots of things, but I believe if you take a look at Washington State's law, and then keep up on changes, because there may be something that's even a little more has more requirements than Washington State in the future. In Washington State, actually, it's not only posting the salary ranges, but also providing a description of all the benefits that are available to the position.
Oh, interesting. So are any of the other state laws requiring the disclosure of benefits?
Now, off the top of my head, I don't think so. But it's, 401k, health benefits, and you see that a lot anyway, right? And most generally in job postings, a lot of companies will post that.
So it's interesting because I'm hearing some employers say, this is going to hurt us from attracting people. And then I hear other employers saying, actually, it kind of helps with the screening process because if we're posting the salaries, then we're automatically letting people know where we are. So that might say for some people, they'll either say, yes, I'm going to apply, or this is not where I need to be. Any thoughts on that or what you're seeing with your employers?
I'm not sure I have any real specific insight or specific details on that. I have a couple of thoughts. It's I think the one thing, employers are struggling to find candidates.
Mm-hmm.
And we are looking at, as you point out, a whole new generation coming in who've lived their life in an open fashion on social media. And they want to be talking about everything, including salary. So it's really going to have to be something that will become part of the culture of recruiting candidates, whether companies want to or not, I think. It also, the disclosure provides information, and more information is typically better.
Mm-hmm. You make me think, and I know I've seen this in our practice. We've done a lot of work, particularly in the last couple of years, with organizations that are reimagining their pay structures to be more competitive and to align with their salary ranges. I mean, it still surprises me that there are still employers out there that don't have salary ranges for certain jobs. So my question for you is, how important is it for an employer to have a sound pay structure in place from a legal perspective?
It's critical. I mean, there's going to be this renewed focus on compensation, and not from from an enforcement perspective. And I think it's going to be a big issue for the federal enforcement agencies, including the EEOC. Helter-skelter approach to compensation is problematic when somebody starts drilling down, because it's, and the differences may not be based necessarily on any protected category, but having an objective structure for comp, keeping up to date on market changes in comp, and evaluating those decisions are critically important. Do I pay, do my friends make more money than if I hire a friend and pay that friend more money than somebody else sitting in the same job with similar skills? It's I'm not sure whether somebody would say that ultimately is illegal discrimination, but it's not a fair and equitable way to compensate the workforce. Look, a lot of folks, I think there's a lot of information out for HR departments to sort of gather information about market ranges. There's certainly a lot of organizations that assist companies in setting up objective pay plans, which seems really critical these days, given the push by all the enforcement agencies and the, state initiatives to crack down on the wage gap.
It's interesting because we've seen a real uptick in the request to construct pay structures, and also to create the criteria in which to place people, so that you could. And when I think about the pay disclosure requiring that you post a salary range, how do you speak to that salary range? What's the difference between you or me being put in the first quartile or the second quartile of that range? Are you seeing that as something that employers are focused on more today than perhaps before?
I think so. I mean, I work with a lot of federal contractors who are very focused on compensation. They have to be.
One of the things that we often talk to our employers about too, and I'm really curious to hear your perspective on this, particularly since you get involved in when things go south. How important is it for managers to be able to speak to a pay structure, not be an expert, but to be able to speak to a pay structure?
You mean a line managers?
A line manager, like you're I'm your employee, and I come to you and I'm like, Joe, why am I making this when this job pays this?
All right. It's an interesting question. I think there's been a culture of secrecy around compensation for a long time. And I've had this now with employers sort of training their line managers on the system, the compensation system and how it works, what influences pay, encouraging and training managers on with decisions with discretion on pay increases, and then sort of checkpoints, guardrails set up to keep things in line.
Can you share any stories? I obviously not disclosing any information, but I'm just curious to know where can things go wrong, or where have you seen things go wrong for an employer with regard to pay practices?
I think one of the biggest challenges for employers are where a company is acquiring another entity and you're trying to integrate a comp system into your comp system. And so those can be very challenging until those sort of issues and sort of inconsistencies in systems can be worked through and dealt with. I mean, there's always a financial aspect to this, to making adjustments in salary. And so that may not happen overnight. And so that's probably what I see the most is the integration of a whole different comp system into a company's existing comp system.
I would imagine in that space, we see it also on the benefits side. So when you're integrating two companies with two different benefit plans and two different sets of offerings, so it really requires some planning and thought there.
Right. So and those issues may not be resolved overnight. Right. You may have past practices for years with long-time employees who may be what now might be above the grade or in a different sort of compensation or incentive structure that may look a little funny, but again, it's sort of a legacy issue.
Mm-hmm.
That occurs from time to time as well.
Yeah. So for anyone listening right now who's either a business leader or human resources person or involved in setting pay practices for an organization, what can or should an employer be doing now to ensure that their compensation practices are fair and equitable?
It is a very challenging environment, and I think we touched on this. Setting objective factors for salary decisions is really important, but having a system, not having a system, having a sort of a loose, I think I'll pay this for this job because I saw this salary survey on the internet and it looks like, this is what I see. But the idea of setting a formal salary system, and I think you probably are, aware of, what's the function, evaluating what a job is, what are the actual duties of the job, preparing a job description, which is something that has sort of fallen out of favor, I think, over the last 10 to 15 years, and keeping those up to date is pretty critical. Are people really, what's the content of the job? And writing a quick job description may not be the answer when you really need to talk to the folks doing the job to understand what they do and get perspective of all of those stakeholders, whether it be the employee, the supervisor, the manager, and observations, because it's it's very complicated. I think that to put together a compensation system based on objective factors and what people do.
It's so interesting you bring up the job description because I find oftentimes one of the first questions we ask when we're engaging with groups on compensation studies is, how up to date are your job descriptions? And I'd say the most common response is, well, about half of them have been updated. Well, how recently? Well, maybe in the last 3 to 5 years. But it's such an important tool for and foundational basis for so many decisions. Yes,
I would agree with you. I think that there's folks have gotten into shorthand of writing a few of the job responsibilities and qualifications, and some of the postings are pretty interesting and pretty qualitative and not necessarily so quantitative and focused on what are your actual task levels of responsibility, judgment and discretion. That's incredibly important.
Okay, so takeaway for all the listeners right now, if you haven't done this in the last year or any time that you're a position, somebody leaves a position, you're refilling it, please update job description. Do you agree, Joe?
Absolutely. And make sure the job descriptions accurately reflect what the folks in the positions do, to understand what the actual work is that's being done.
Great. There's one final thing I want to talk to you about. I heard you use the word the employers have been operating in this this world of secrecy around employees being able to speak about salaries and things. And I mean, that really is how it's been until recently. That's what everyone believed to be true. That secrecy from an HR perspective, seems to breed distrust in organizations. And we know that when trust is compromised in organizations, other things can happen. And in today's climate, like if you think about organizations becoming a little bit more transparent, whatever that means to them with compensation, and being more comfortable and confident in talking about pay or having pay structures that or systems in place that they know are objective and they can speak to. How important is that to building trust between leaders and staff in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think what stands out is you probably are going to have a more positive sort of view from staff on the workforce and productivity. It's not, again, not a closed environment, more open. And you see that certainly in larger organizations or their efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion are working toward that. Some, I guess, are making better, some baby steps, bigger steps. But distrust is a problem. And if you're trying to keep employees, I mean, there's a the market these days are very good for employees who can move at just a moment's notice. And I still think that's true for, again, sort of higher level folks, office workers. And so if, you waste a lot of money when you have to fill new jobs. So there's, productivity, I think improvement, overall workplace employee engagement is going to be better. It seems to make a lot of sense.
Great. All right, Joe, parting tips for our listeners. What are 1 or 2 tips you would give them to address this ever-changing pay disclosure world we're living in right now?
Well, look, I think the internet enables a lot of folks to do a lot of research. I think if there's a company that has struggled with comp and struggles with setting initial salaries and increases, that putting together a formal compensation structure seems critical to me, and it's very important. A lot of companies these days are doing pay equity studies, engaging outside compensation professionals to analyze their pay practices using, regression analyses. Uh, uh, that also is sort of a very good way to, as I would say, look under the hood. But those things should be undertaken very carefully, and I think companies would want to reach out to their regular counsel, whether in-house or outside counsel, to get some direction on how to have those projects conducted. I mean, you want to try to keep those confidential and privileged, and understand, what might be your risk from a legal perspective.
Great. So, Joe Bennett, I want to thank you for being our guest today on Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. And to all our listeners out there, I hope you got a couple of valuable tips today on how you can go back and think about your own pay practices and ensuring not only compliance, but in taking appropriate steps to make sure that you are building that the right level of pay transparency for you to attract and retain talent. So I'm Allison DeFlorio, and I want to thank you again for joining us. And on Hold On, Let Me Close My Door. And until next time.